Joining us here in the studio is our panel. I'm so happy to have you. First of all, let me welcome Kennedy Mwikya. Kennedy is a Mandela Washington Fellow and a native of Kenya. We also have Emira Woods, who is Associate Fellow of the Institute for Policy Studies with a special emphasis on Africa and the developing world, and James Ngundi. He is a political analyst and a native of Kenya. Welcome, the three of you, to Africa 54.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
It's good to have you here. Let me start with you, Dr. Ngundi. What do you make of President Obama's visit to Kenya at this time of his presidency?
I think it's critical. I mean, it would have been a little much better if he had gone earlier, when he, in the eyes of many people, still had a lot of time to work on Kenyan issues and African issues in general. But at the same time, the fact that he's going in while he's still president means a lot to different constituencies in the country. And I think at the end, something you mentioned, the momentum, it's what, what people do with the momentum that he has created at this point.
So Dr. Ngundi said it means a lot. And what does it mean for the people of Africa, Emira, when you look at the big picture, how U.S. policy has been ongoing under his presidency?
I would say it means wonderful photo ops. It means great symbolism. But clearly, all of the excitement and expectation when President Obama came into office now, 6 years ago, has waned. And the reality is that, we see great things happening in other parts of the world. Just this week, a flag went up here in Washington for Cuba. There was a reset button in terms of how the U.S. connected with Cuba. And I think what many hoped for was that President Obama would bring a similar reset button for U.S.-Africa engagement. And what we've gotten instead is more of the same. We've gotten a status quo where U.S. interests, primarily in the extractive industries, oil, gas, mining, land, dominate. Almost 90% of U.S. trade is in these arenas. And what you have at the same time is increasing unemployment, poverty throughout the continent, an incredible inequality growing throughout the continent. So while we get the great pictures, we really don't have much in terms of the changes that are needed on the structural underpinnings of an economic system that has continued to exploit Africa at the benefit of, some say the 1%, but those that have continued to benefit both in the U.S., internationally, and it's primarily those on whose land the resources lie that pay the heaviest price.
And one of the important issues that you mentioned is unemployment. Let me go to you, Kennedy, as a youth, a young leader, African leader and Kenyan leader. There's been this big excitement around the need to empower the youth. You're here for the Washington Mandela Fellowship. Tell us about this momentum and how you are benefiting from it, how you're seeing your friends benefit from it.
Thank you so much for the question. As a young leader, we know that President Obama is invested in entrepreneurship in Africa. While at the GES in Nairobi, he announced a new package deal of $1 billion in investment on entrepreneurship for youth. But I still feel like it's not enough. African youth are at the crossroads of investment and entrepreneurship and innovation in Africa, and we need more to see more investment and more confidence in the youth. Personally, I don't work on entrepreneurship, but I can see that on so many issues in the continent, that African youth are actually invested in them. They are the future, and they need to see that what we're creating for when we grow up, for our children, for our grandchildren, works for them as much as it works for us. So that's very exciting for me. Yeah.
So we hear a lot about the fact that what is being done is not enough. Even Emira has mentioned a little bit, she has touched a little bit on that. And James, what do you see in terms of where we need to reinforce moving forward?
Well, there's no question about it, and I probably would agree to some extent with my colleague. At the same time, I think it's important to also look at this as an African issue that Africans also need to take ownership of. The important thing to look at this point is what this trip means to different constituencies in Kenya first, and on the African continent in general. And I think it is easy to look at the time that's lost opportunities that have been lost. But I think it is important for us to look at what are the opportunities that are now being set off, that are being started by this visit, that are being, that we can take advantage of and move forward as a continent, as a country, if we focus on Kenya. So I think that, to me, is more important than, crying over spilled water, lost opportunities. There is an opportunity right now. There is a momentum that is being created, and I think that's critical. If Africans can take advantage of this momentum now, before the first African-American president leaves office, now that he's visiting the continent as president, we need to take advantage of that. There are opportunities. Security, I think, remains a huge issue. Yes, and I think if we could take advantage of U.S. resources and what the visit of the president potentially means in terms of security on the continent, I think that would be important. I actually put security above economic issues.
And that's specific to Kenya or just Africa in general?
I think generally, I can speak specifically for Kenya, but I would argue that it obtains for many other African countries. The absence of security in many of our countries has undermined any economic progress we could claim. Yeah. Now we are talking about Boko Haram in Nigeria.
Al-Shabaab, the threat of Al-Shabaab in your region.
Absolutely. Yes. And that has impacted our economies dramatically. So security is an important area that I think if we can all invest in, and if we could get the assistance that we can, not just from the US, but from other partners, I think that would be critical. Areas of education, investment in the youth, educating the youth, and working to eliminate poverty and issues of health. For me, that is critical.
What about, Emira, if we have security and we don't have democracy, what do you think the priorities are at this point? If we do not make it Kenya-specific, because obviously there's a threat of Al-Shabaab and security is definitely top on the agenda. But what do you make about democracy and the responsibility of Africans themselves?
Well, I think on this question, you have to recognize that the U.S. is actually more interested and has invested far more in their notion of security than in economic development or trade. So what you have is actually an increase in U.S. both military assistance, sales of military equipment, military training and intelligence, an increase in those areas, and actually a decrease in U.S. trade and investment in Africa, particularly over the last 3 to 5 years. So U.S. in 2012, trade was about 150 or so billion. It's gone down. 2014 figures were about 77 billion, right? Whereas if you compare to China, it's 212 billion in 2014, right? So you see a steady decline in terms of investment and an increase in terms of military assistance. And I think we have to underscore that the military assistance is often part of the problem. Let's remember, Al-Shabaab, was created back in 2006 in response to U.S. military airstrikes in Somalia, in response to U.S. military assaults on Somalia, right? So I think we have to pull back the lens and understand that actually U.S. military engagement is bringing more insecurity. It's bringing more instability and actually creates more of a problem in terms of human security. Across the continent, it's human needs that people clamor for. It's jobs with decent wages. It's being able to have good schools, being able to have health care that's affordable and accessible to all. These are the building blocks of secure communities, secure societies, and a secure Africa, right? So it is investing in those areas that will bring forth an infrastructure that brings good jobs, will bring forth manufacturing that brings good jobs, right? I mean, it's trade unions, whether it's those in South Africa or Kenya or around the continent, are clamoring for those decent jobs and decent wages for an economy that works for all. That should be the emphasis, not the photo ops or increased military spending.
What about initiatives such as Power Africa, the Global Entrepreneurship Summit, even the Yali Fellowship? Aren't these steps in the right direction? What do you make of it? AGOA has been extended to 10 years. What about these initiatives?
Well, I think many see, again, the programs, especially if you mention the trade fact, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, as actually bringing more growth and opportunity to the U.S. than to Africa, right, for the last 15 years. I think there are some concerns that you still have not really a sufficient investment or attention to areas outside those extractive industries. It is primarily oil and liquefied natural gas that are the premier beneficiaries of U.S. trade and investment, of AGOA. So again, until you're able to look to other sectors where you are able to have manufacturing, you continue to have an unequal growth. You have growth, but there is this inequality throughout the continent that is actually making people worse off than they were 10 years ago, worse off in some instances than they were, before their grandparents' generations. Yeah. This is the problem.
Now, Kennedy, what are the youth interested in? If you speak from your experience and the people around you, Emira spoke about the need to really focus on manufacturing, among other things, as solution. What are the youth looking into?
Well, personally, from my own experience, I was involved in a project by Amnesty International and Open Societies known as Africa Not for Sale. And young people were focusing a lot on more openness and more transparency, not only on the Africa Rising narrative, where Africa Rising economic growth is actually leading to a lot of economic disparities between the rich and the poor. They want more openness, more redistribution, and more focus on youth-centric ways of solving Africa's economic issues. And that inevitably lands on the question of good governance, transparency, and also human rights and the rule of law. Sadly, in Africa, the question of Africa Rising, all this economic growth is first of all empowering a very small and selfish elite, and second of all empowering the government to become even more strong, strong-arming, especially on the civil society. Personally, that's my experience in Kenya on all fronts of activism, especially youth activism, which is usually very underfunded. As I said before, youth are at the crossroads and they're asking a lot of difficult questions, and one of the questions is jobs. We had we had the Africa Leadership Summit last year, where 50 of Africa's head of states were in DC talking about economy, talking about growth, talking about leadership. There were a lot of trade deals, multilateral and also bilateral deals concluded during that summit. But what are the effects? What are youth seeing these effects on the ground? I haven't seen a seismic change in, unemployment levels for the youth, which are at devastating levels. If we continue like this, we're going to see generational poverty, where it becomes with the next generation, there's a less likelihood of economic and financial mobility from one class to another. So youth are asking difficult questions, and those difficult questions are also complex. So a lot of young people right now are thinking about how economic growth can be coupled with human development, and that's really important. So they want to see jobs, but not just any jobs, good jobs, sustainable jobs, and jobs which can take them to the next generation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And let's talk about the role of the diaspora. As a Kenyan here, how does the diaspora contribute to helping this dynamic to ensure that, Africa is moving forward and there is more investment? We know about remittances, all the money that is being sent, but how do we take it to the next level?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think for the diaspora, continued interest in what is going on, a lot of that will be determined by how governments respond to outreaches by diasporans. A lot of governments may have policies that encourage people in the diaspora to invest. Kenya specifically does have some programs, some tax breaks, some perks that encourage people to invest. I think also continuing to support programs on the ground. There are people in the diaspora who have established, non-governmental organizations or programs that assist people at the grassroots level, not just partnering with governments. So I think those are things that people in the diaspora can do, but more importantly is just remaining engaged in what goes on the ground.
Okay.
Let me touch very briefly on the issue
because I'd like you to react on the African Union trip, Emira, before we leave. So very briefly.
Yeah, just the issue of governance. I mean, I think governance is important on the continent. Yes. And I really think as a continent, we have to look at governance from within rather than looking at governance from without.
Yes.
A lot of the problems that we are facing on the continent, most African countries, whether it's issues of youth unemployment, whether it's corruption, it's really a question of governance from within. And whatever is going to be done by the United States and the president's visit is going to be hinged on what do we do from within as Africans. Okay, I have to cut you off right there. And Emira, please, let me have your reaction. The president is going to Ethiopia next, meeting with leaders from the African Union. What should be on the agenda? What should be the priority in terms of where we are now and where we need to do moving forward?
Well, I think we're in this, what many say is the lessons from Greece, you know, where there are structures of a global economy that have to be questioned. A neoliberal economic model has not worked in many countries, basically you could say in all countries on the continent. And so there needs to be, if we were to push that reset button and shape the agenda of the African Union, there needs to be a real critique of a system where, you know, only 1%, a very narrow band, benefit. And it's that narrow elite tied to global multinational corporations that have so much power and strength. So I think we've got to be able to challenge those underlying structures that are incredibly oppressing our continent and our peoples, and to learn the lessons of Greece. We have to demand an economy that provides essential services for all, not only for a narrow band. We have to demand governments that pay attention to the needs of all, not just a narrow elite. And until we do that, we will continue with the status quo. And fundamentally, I wish that could be on the agenda for the African Union. My worry is that it'll be more photo ops.
So many issues on the agenda when it comes to the way we need to move forward with the African Union, with business entrepreneurship. But thank you so much for joining us today, James, Emira, and Kennedy. I thank you for your time. And that was Kennedy Mwikya, Mandela Washington Fellow, Emira Woods, Associate Fellow, Institute for Policy Studies, and James Ngundi, a political analyst and a native of Kenya. That's all for this special Saturday edition of Africa 54. Thanks for joining us.